It was a regular Thursday afternoon at a quiet McDonald's tucked into a busy corner of Los Angeles. The scent of crispy fries and fresh burgers filled the air as people bustled about, grabbing quick meals or chatting in booths. Among them, a man wearing a simple black cap and sunglasses walked in, his presence understated yet unmistakable. It was Keanu Reeves. Despite his fame, he moved through the world like an unassuming shadow, just another person seeking a moment of normalcy. Keanu wasn't there for fanfare. He wasn't there for attention. He just wanted a burger, a coffee, and a small slice of peace in his whirlwind life. As he stood in line, glancing at the brightly lit menu overhead, no one seemed to notice him, at least not at first. That was until two small figures appeared seemingly out of nowhere, weaving through the tables with uncanny synchronization. They were twins. No more than 6 or 7 years old, their dark, curly hair framed faces that were strikingly identical, yet each held a unique spark. They wore matching black hoodies, slightly oversized, and moved as though drawn by an invisible string. They paused briefly at a table near the corner, their heads tilting in silent conversation, and then, without hesitation, walked straight toward Keanu. He didn't notice them at first. He was busy fishing a few crumpled bills from his pocket, mentally debating between a Big Mac and a quarter pounder. But then he felt it, a tug at the hem of his jacket. He turned, expecting perhaps a fan or maybe a curious child who had recognized him. What he saw, however, froze him in place. The twins stood there, their large, dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that didn't match their small frames. They didn't smile. They didn't speak right away, but there was something in their gaze, something knowing, something almost ancient. It was as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. "Mr. Reeves," the boy said softly, his voice so steady it almost startled Keanu. "We need to tell you something." Keanu blinked, lowering himself slightly to meet their eye level. "You know who I am?" he asked, his tone kind but cautious. Children recognized him often, but this felt different. There was no excitement, no giddy surprise, just that quiet, unwavering stare. The girl nodded. "Yes," she said simply. "And we know what you've been dreaming about." The words hit Keanu like a jolt. He straightened up, his heart skipping a beat. Dreaming? He hadn't told anyone about the restless nights he'd been having, the vivid dreams that left him waking up in a cold sweat, feeling as though the weight of the universe was pressing on his chest. They were strange, surreal dreams filled with fragmented images, a vast expanse of stars, a door that wouldn't open, and voices he couldn't quite make out. "How do you?" He hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was listening. The cashier called for the next customer, but the twins had his full attention now. "What are you talking about?" The boy took a step closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "You have questions. About what's out there, about who you are, and why you've been chosen." "Chosen," Keanu repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The word sent a chill down his spine. This was absurd. It had to be. They were just kids. Kids with overactive imaginations, or maybe a knack for saying creepy things. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were speaking to something buried deep inside him, something he didn't even fully understand. The girl placed a small hand on his arm. "You're not just dreaming," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze but firm with certainty. "You're remembering." Keanu felt the ground shift beneath him. He opened his mouth to respond, to ask what they meant, but no words came out. The twins exchanged a glance, as if deciding silently how much more they should reveal. Finally, the boy leaned in close, his next words barely audible. "They're waiting for you," he said, "but if you don't listen, it'll be too late." Before Keanu could press them further, the twins turned and began walking away, their small figures blending seamlessly back into the crowd. For a moment, he stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Who were they? How did they know about his dreams? And what did they mean by too late? He spun around, scanning the restaurant for any sign of them. But they had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. All that remained was the faint echo of their words, reverberating in his mind like the fading notes of a haunting melody. Keanu stood frozen in place, the world around him moving in a haze. The laughter of kids at a nearby table, the rhythmic clatter of the kitchen, even the hum of the overhead lights. All of it felt distant, like background noise in a dream. The twins' words replayed in his mind, each one carving a deeper groove of unease. He turned back toward the counter, hoping for some grounding in the familiar, but the cashier's cheerful smile seemed oddly out of place now. His order was ready, a brown paper bag with a steaming coffee on the tray beside it. He grabbed it mechanically, muttering a soft thanks before heading toward a booth in the corner. His usual practice would have been to sit quietly, enjoy his food, and fade into the background. Today, that plan was impossible. Sliding into the seat, Keanu set the tray down and rested his elbows on the table, his hands clasped tightly together. He wasn't a stranger to strange encounters. Fans sometimes said peculiar things, claiming they'd seen him in dreams or insisting that he'd saved them in ways he couldn't have possibly been aware of. But this felt entirely different. They had spoken about his dreams, the ones he'd been having almost nightly for weeks now. Dreams that felt more like memories than fragments of his subconscious. In them, he was always floating, weightless, surrounded by an endless sea of stars. There was a figure in the distance, always out of reach, standing in front of an enormous door that pulsed with faint golden light. No matter how hard he tried, he could never move closer, and the figure never turned around. He would wake up feeling as though he had been shouting in a language he didn't know, trying to say something vital but unable to form the words. What if the twins were right? What if these weren't just dreams? The thought was absurd, and yet his gut told him to pay attention. His gut had been right before, especially at moments where logic failed him. He leaned back in his seat, staring out the window at the bustling street beyond. Life carried on out there as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath his feet. But to Keanu, everything felt different. He wasn't sure why, but he felt watched now. Not in the way a celebrity might feel watched, but something deeper. A presence he couldn't define. The twins' words gnawed at him. They're waiting for you, but if you don't listen, it'll be too late. Who was waiting? And what exactly was at stake? He looked down at his untouched burger and coffee. His appetite had evaporated. Instead, he reached for his phone, thumbing through his contacts, debating who he could call to talk this out. A friend, a spiritual advisor, someone who could tell him he was overthinking this and that it was just a coincidence. He stopped scrolling when his thumb landed on the name, Marta. She was a producer he'd worked with years ago on a documentary about ancient civilizations and their unexplained myths. They kept in touch, and she had a knack for digging into the kind of mysteries that didn't fit neatly into any box. She wasn't just a skeptic, she was a seeker. If anyone would listen without judgment, it was her. He hit the call button, and after a few rings, her warm, familiar voice answered. Keanu. Long time no hear. What's up? Marta, he began, hesitating. How did he even explain this without sounding unhinged? I need your opinion on something. Something. Weird. Weird is my specialty, she joked, though there was a note of curiosity in her tone. What's going on? He took a deep breath and told her everything. The McDonald's, the twins, the dreams. He didn't hold back, describing the strange sense of urgency in their voices, and the chilling way their words had seemed to pierce straight through him. He even mentioned the recurring imagery in his dreams, though he kept his voice low, glancing around the restaurant to make sure no one was listening. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marta, he prompted, his voice tight with uncertainty. I'm here, she said finally. Her usual light-hearted tone was gone, replaced by something heavier. Keanu, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but this doesn't sound random. I mean, kids don't just walk up to people and say things like that. And if they're referencing something you've been dreaming about, something personal, it could mean. She trailed off as if struggling to find the right words. Could mean what? Keanu pressed. That they know something, she said. Or maybe someone sent them. Sent them. The idea sent a shiver down his spine. By who? I don't know, Marta admitted. But I've read accounts of things like this happening before. People receiving messages, warnings, guidance, whatever you want to call it. Usually it's tied to something big. Something that's about to happen or something the person needs to do. Her words didn't offer much comfort. If anything, they made the weight on his chest feel even heavier. What do I do? He asked, his voice quieter now. Marta was silent for a moment before replying. Keep track of everything. Your dreams, your thoughts, anything that feels connected to this. And if you can, try to find those kids again. They might know more than they told you. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Thanks, Marta. Be careful, Keanu, she said softly before hanging up. He stared at his phone for a long time after the call ended, Marta's words swirling in his mind. Keep track of everything. Try to find them again. Be careful. It was all good advice, but he had no idea where to start. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of laughter. It was light, almost melodic, and for a moment he thought it was coming from one of the nearby tables. But when he looked around, the restaurant seemed eerily quiet. Too quiet. The laughter came again, this time louder, and it sent a chill through him. It wasn't coming from inside the restaurant. It was coming from outside. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. There, standing on the sidewalk just beyond the glass, were the twins. They weren't smiling. Their faces were as serious as before, but the boy's lips moved slightly, as if he was saying something. Keanu couldn't hear the words through the glass, but his heart thudded in his chest. He felt a surge of adrenaline, an instinctive urge to get up and follow them. But when he blinked, they were gone. Vanished. Keanu pushed himself to his feet, leaving his tray behind as he rushed out the door. He scanned the street, his eyes darting between the pedestrians, the parked cars, the open storefronts. But there was no sign of them. It was as if they had dissolved into thin air. For a moment he stood there, feeling utterly lost. The city's noise pressed in around him. The honking horns, the chatter of strangers, the roar of a distant engine. It all felt too loud, too overwhelming. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Keanu lingered on the sidewalk, scanning the crowd with growing unease. He was certain the twins had been there just moments ago, their presence undeniable. And now they were gone again, leaving behind nothing but a sense of urgency that knotted his chest tighter with every passing second. He stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, his fingers brushing against the edge of his phone. A part of him wanted to call Marta back, to ask if she had any idea what to do next, but another part hesitated. He already felt like he was spiraling into something bigger than he could grasp. As he began walking aimlessly down the block, the sounds of the city enveloped him. Footsteps clattering on pavement, the hum of distant conversations, the occasional honk of a horn. These were ordinary sounds, grounding sounds, but the world didn't feel ordinary anymore. Everything felt charged, like static electricity was buzzing just beneath the surface. He passed shop windows reflecting his faintly disheveled figure, and for a moment, he barely recognized himself. There was something haunted in his eyes now, a reflection of questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The first step, he decided, was figuring out where the twins had gone. He thought back to their sudden appearance and disappearance, trying to piece together any details he might have missed. They hadn't come in with anyone, and no one seemed to notice them leave. It was like they existed on their own wavelength, slipping in and out of reality as easily as stepping through a door. But where was that door, and why had they chosen him? He ducked into a small park a few blocks away, hoping to clear his head. It was quieter here, the bustle of the city muted by the rustling of trees and the occasional chirp of birds. He found an empty bench near a fountain and sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. As his gaze drifted, he noticed a group of kids playing tag near the swings, their laughter echoing through the air. For a moment, he felt a pang of nostalgia, a fleeting memory of simpler times. But then something about the scene caught his attention. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, stood apart from the others. He wasn't playing. He was just watching, his expression eerily focused. His dark hoodie was unmistakable, though it was too far away to be sure it was the same as the twins. Keanu's pulse quickened. Could it be one of them? Before he could think, he was on his feet, walking quickly toward the boy. But as he approached, the boy turned and ran, darting into a narrow path that cut through the trees. "Hey, wait!" Keanu called out, his voice breaking the stillness of the park. He broke into a jog, following the boy down the path, his mind racing. He didn't know what he'd say if he caught up, but he knew he couldn't let him slip away. Not again. The path twisted and turned, and Keanu found himself deeper in the park than he'd ever been. The sounds of the city had faded entirely now, replaced by an almost oppressive quiet. He slowed his pace, glancing around, his breath coming in steady but shallow gasps. The boy was gone, or at least out of sight. For a moment, he wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the tension, the dreams, and the twins' cryptic message had all been too much, twisting his perception into something surreal. Then he heard it, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, insistent. He turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Hello," he called out, his voice steady but laced with unease. "Is someone there?" The whisper came again, louder this time. And then, like a sudden wind rustling through the trees, a voice cut through the quiet. "You're close, but you're not ready." Keanu froze. The voice wasn't a child's. It was deeper, resonant, and distinctly male. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. "Who said that?" he demanded, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest. "Show yourself." There was no reply, just the soft rustle of leaves overhead. But something in the air had shifted. He could feel it, like the space around him had grown heavier, more alive. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the dense foliage. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of something just beyond the edge of his vision. But when he turned to focus, there was nothing. Keanu. The voice came again, closer this time. It sent a ripple of dread through him, not because it was menacing, but because it seemed to come from inside his head as much as outside it. He spun around, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice rising slightly. "What do you want from me?" The answer came not in words, but in sensation. A wave of warmth and light washed over him, momentarily blinding him. He stumbled back, shielding his eyes as his surroundings seemed to blur and shift. When the light faded, he found himself standing in the middle of a clearing he didn't recognize. The air was different here, thicker, quieter, as though the world itself was holding its breath. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, not a child, but a man, tall and cloaked in shadows that seemed to ripple like water. His face was obscured, but his presence was overwhelming, filling the space with an energy Keanu could feel in his bones. "You've been called," the figure said, his voice echoing strangely as though it came from every direction at once. "Called for what?" Keanu asked, his voice tight with frustration. "I don't understand any of this. Who are you? What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward the ground at Keanu's feet. There in the dirt was a faintly glowing symbol, a circle encasing a series of intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as he stared at them. It was familiar, and yet he couldn't place where he'd seen it before. "You've seen this," the figure said, as though reading his thoughts. "In your dreams, in your memories." Keanu's breath caught. He had seen it, though only in fleeting glimpses. It was always etched into the door that stood at the center of his recurring visions, pulsing faintly as he struggled to reach it. "What does it mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure stepped closer, the shadows around him deepening. "It is a key," he said, "but only if you are willing to open the door." "What door?" Keanu demanded, his frustration boiling over. "Why me? What am I supposed to do?" The figure didn't reply. Instead, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the shadows like mist under the morning sun. "Listen to the whispers," he said, his voice growing distant. "Follow them. And remember, time is running out." Before Keanu could respond, the light around him shifted again, and he was back in the park. The clearing, the figure, the glowing symbol, all of it was gone. He stood there, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. His hands were trembling, his mind racing. One thing was clear now, the twins hadn't been wrong. Someone was waiting for him. And whatever it wasn't going to let him ignore it. Keanu stood in the park, his legs rooted to the ground, his mind spinning. He had felt the shift in reality, seen the figure, heard the voice. It was undeniable now. This wasn't some elaborate trick or his mind playing games. Something far beyond his understanding was happening, and for reasons he couldn't fathom, it had chosen him. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest like a boulder, making it hard to breathe. He turned slowly, scanning the park. The normal sounds of the city had returned, the chatter of kids playing, the distant hum of traffic. But they felt wrong, like a poorly tuned radio station trying to drown out the truth. He reached for his phone again, his fingers fumbling as he scrolled to Marta's name and hit call. This time, the phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. He tried again, but the result was the same. "Marta," he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with urgency. "Come on, pick up." But she didn't. And suddenly, Keanu felt very alone. He tried to focus, to think through what had just happened. The figure in the clearing had said he was called, that there was a door, a key, and whispers to follow. It sounded like riddles, but there was no denying the power behind the words. If this was real, and it was real, he needed to figure out what to do next. He retraced his steps out of the park, his mind racing. The twins had been the first to reach out, their cryptic words setting everything into motion. If they were the ones guiding him, then finding them again was his only lead. But where would they be? They had vanished so easily, slipping in and out of sight like ghosts. He needed more than luck to find them again. As he approached the busy street, something caught his eye, a flash of black moving through the crowd. His heart leaped as he spotted the unmistakable silhouettes of the twins, weaving effortlessly between pedestrians. They were further up the block, walking with that same synchronized rhythm, as if they were bound together by something invisible. "Hey," Keanu called out, his voice cutting through the noise. He pushed through the crowd, his long strides eating up the distance between them. But just as he got close, the twins turned a corner, disappearing down a narrow alley. Keanu broke into a run, rounding the corner with his breath hitching in his chest. The alley was dark, the buildings on either side casting deep shadows. It was eerily quiet here, the noise of the street muffled as though he'd stepped into a different world. The twins were nowhere in sight, but Keanu pressed forward, his instincts pulling him deeper into the shadows. "Where are you?" he muttered, his voice low. His footsteps echoed against the brick walls, the sound amplifying his growing unease. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly, bending and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. It felt wrong, like the space itself was shifting around him, pulling him further from the familiar. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he heard it again, the whisper. It was faint at first, blending with the soft rustle of the wind, but it grew louder as he moved forward. The words were still unclear, but the tone was unmistakable, urging, guiding, pulling him closer to something unseen. He followed the sound, his pulse quickening with every step. At the end of the alley, he found himself standing in front of an old, rusted door. It was heavy, industrial, with peeling paint and no visible markings. Yet it felt significant, like it was humming with energy. Keanu reached out instinctively, his hand hovering just inches from the surface. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. He hesitated, his fingers trembling as they grazed the cold metal. The moment he touched the door, a jolt of energy shot through him, and the world around him seemed to dissolve. Colors blurred into each other, the alley fading into a kaleidoscope of light and sound. Keanu staggered back, shielding his eyes as the intensity grew. And then, just as suddenly, everything snapped into focus. He was no longer in the alley. He stood in a vast, empty expanse, the ground beneath his feet shimmering like liquid glass. Above him, the sky was a swirling vortex of stars and darkness, endless and overwhelming. It was breathtaking and terrifying all at once, a place that felt both infinite and impossibly intimate. In the center of the expanse stood the door from his dreams. Massive and imposing, it pulsed with golden light, its intricate patterns shifting like living things. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the door he had seen night after night, always out of reach. But now it was here, tangible and waiting. As he approached, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct than ever. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, yet the meaning resonated deep within him. He felt the urgency, their plea for action. But as he reached out, the air around him thickened, pushing back against him like an invisible barrier. "You're close," a voice said behind him, deep and steady. Keanu turned sharply, his heart pounding as he faced the figure from the park. This time, the shadows didn't obscure his face. The man was older, his features sharp and weathered, his eyes glowing faintly with a light that seemed otherworldly. "Who are you?" Keanu asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "What is this place?" The man stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "This is the space between," he said, "a realm of potential, of memory, of truth." Keanu frowned, the words stirring something in him he couldn't explain. "What does that mean? Why am I here?" "Because you are the key," the man replied, his gaze piercing. "The door can only be opened by one who understands its purpose." Keanu shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't understand anything. Why me? What do you want from me?" The man's expression softened, though his eyes remained intense. "You carry something within you, Keanu. Something ancient, something powerful. It's been calling to you, guiding you here, but the choice to act is yours alone." The words hit Keanu like a hammer, the weight of them pressing down on him. He wanted to argue, to demand clearer answers, but deep down he knew the man was right. There was something inside him, something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. But before he could respond, the whispers shifted, growing frantic and sharp. The golden light around the door dimmed, and the stars above began to flicker, as though something was threatening to snuff them out. Keanu turned to the man, his voice urgent. "What's happening?" "Time is running out," the man said, his tone grim. "The balance is shifting. If the door is not opened, everything will fall into darkness." Keanu's chest tightened. "How do I open it?" The man gestured toward the door, his voice steady. "You already know." Keanu turned back to the door, his mind racing. The patterns on its surface seemed to move faster now, their golden glow fighting against the encroaching shadows. He reached out again, his fingers brushing the cool metal. This time, the resistance was stronger, the whispers almost deafening. And then, just as his resolve hardened, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, an oppressive stillness that made his heart pound. He glanced over his shoulder, but the man was gone. The stars above had dimmed to faint pinpricks, and the ground beneath him began to tremble. Keanu took a deep breath, his hand pressing firmly against the door. Whatever was about to happen, he knew there was no turning back. Keanu pressed his palm against the door, bracing himself for whatever might come next. The trembling beneath his feet grew stronger, and the golden patterns on the door flickered violently, as though they were struggling to hold onto their light. He gritted his teeth, pushing harder, willing the door to respond. But nothing happened. Instead, the air around him grew heavier, thick with a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. "You're not ready," a voice echoed, this time closer and more familiar. Keanu spun around, expecting to see the man from before. Instead, his heart sank as he saw the twins standing side by side, their dark eyes fixed on him. They seemed smaller now, more fragile, but their presence was no less commanding. "What do you mean, I'm not ready?" Keanu asked, his voice cracking with frustration. "I'm here. I followed everything. What else am I supposed to do?" The girl stepped forward, her gaze softer than before. "It's not just about being here," she said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "The door isn't unlocked by force. It responds to understanding." Keanu shook his head, exasperated. "Understanding what? You keep speaking in riddles. I'm running out of time." The boy's expression darkened, and he took a step closer. "Time is running out because you're holding back. You know what you need to do, but you're afraid. That fear is what's keeping the door shut." Keanu opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Was it fear? He thought back to the dreams, the endless struggle to reach the door, the sense of failure that always woke him before he could get close. He hadn't understood why he couldn't move forward then, but now it was beginning to make sense. It wasn't just the door that felt unreachable, it was himself. The part of him that had buried so much pain, so much doubt, in an effort to keep moving. His hand fell away from the door, his fingers curling into a fist as he turned to face the twins fully. "If I'm holding back, then tell me what I'm supposed to let go of. What am I not seeing?" The twins exchanged a glance, and for the first time they looked hesitant. The girl was the one who spoke, her voice quieter now. "The answer isn't in what's ahead," she said. "It's in what you left behind." Keanu's brow furrowed, confusion warring with an uncomfortable realization. "What I left behind?" He echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded solemnly. "The door isn't just a key to what's out there. It's a key to what's inside you. If you don't face it, nothing will change." Before Keanu could process their words, the ground beneath him gave a violent shudder, and the golden patterns on the door erupted in a flash of blinding light. He shielded his eyes, stumbling backward as the entire expanse seemed to crackle with energy. The light dimmed, revealing not just the door, but something new, a second figure standing just beyond it. The figure was shadowed at first, its features indistinct, but as it stepped forward, Keanu felt his breath catch. It was him, or rather, a version of him. The man looked identical in every way, down to the smallest detail, but his expression was cold, almost detached. His doppelganger regarded him with a piercing gaze, as if stripping away every layer of Keanu's being and laying it bare. "You can't go forward until you confront what's holding you back," the figure said, its voice a perfect echo of his own. "And that starts with me." Keanu took a step back, his heart pounding. "What are you?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The figure tilted its head, a faint smirk playing at the corners of its mouth. "I'm you," it said simply. "The part you've ignored, the part you've buried, the part you're afraid to face." A surge of anger flared in Keanu's chest. "I faced plenty," he shot back. "I've lived through pain, loss, things you couldn't even imagine." The figure's smirk widened, and it gestured toward the door. "You've survived, yes, but surviving isn't the same as living. You've spent so long running from the past, trying to protect yourself, that you've locked away the very thing that could set you free." Keanu's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to deny it, to argue, but the words hit too close to the truth. He thought of the years he'd spent pushing through grief, the walls he built to keep the world at bay. He'd told himself it was the only way to move forward, to keep going. But now, standing here, with the weight of the universe pressing down on him, he wasn't so sure anymore. "What do I need to do?" he asked finally, his voice low and strained. The figure stepped closer, its gaze softening. "Stop running," it said. "Stop hiding. You've carried the weight of the past for so long that you've forgotten how to let it go. The door doesn't open with strength. It opens with truth." Keanu swallowed hard, his throat tight. The truth. It sounded simple, but he knew it wasn't. The truth meant looking at everything he tried to avoid. The pain, the fear, the vulnerability he buried so deeply. It meant tearing down the walls he built and standing bare before the world. The twins' voices broke through his thoughts, their words a quiet echo in the charged air. "You're not alone," they said in unison. "You've never been alone." Keanu turned to look at them, their faces calm but filled with a quiet intensity. And in that moment he realized what they were saying. The door wasn't just a barrier, it was a reflection of his fears, his struggles, his hope. If he wanted to move forward, he couldn't do it by force. He had to do it by acceptance. Slowly, he turned back to the door, the golden patterns glowing faintly now, like they were waiting. His doppelganger stepped aside, watching silently as Keanu placed his hand on the door once more. This time, the resistance was different. Not a wall, but a weight, heavy and unyielding. Keanu closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He thought of everything he'd lost, everything he tried to bury. The pain of losing people he loved. The nights spent questioning his purpose. The walls he built to protect himself, even as they isolated him. He let it all rise to the surface, every memory, every feeling, and for the first time, he didn't push it away. "I'm ready," he whispered, his voice trembling but sure. The door pulsed beneath his hand, the golden light flaring brighter than ever. The whispers returned, but this time they were clear. They weren't urging him forward, they were guiding him home.